Welcome to Uncorking a Story. I'm your host, Mike Carlin, and today it's my pleasure to introduce you to Matthew Necci. Not sketchy, Matthew Necci. Matthew is a practicing attorney by trade, so he's definitely not sketchy, although that's to be determined. And the author of The Road Will Someday Bend. He has a penchant for social media and community building, and his daily musings about my beloved UConn Huskies, the New York Mets, and the greater Hartford area, as well as the Adirondacks, can be found on Twitter at UConn and Tech. Welcome to Uncorking a Story, Matthew.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Appreciate it.
Matthew, everyone gets the same first question from me, which is, where does your story as an author begin?
I've always loved writing and storytelling. So, even as a student growing up, I loved history class because I was just fascinated by the stories. American history just completely fascinated me. And then as I got into college, I loved writing. I wrote for the Daily Campus at UConn. So it was that was more in the sports genre, excuse me. And then, as an attorney, it's probably rare. I think, but in our practice, young attorneys tend to get the written assignments that the older attorneys then review and hand in on their own. I've been practicing I've been almost 17 years now. I absolutely love writing. So for me, writing trial briefs and appellate briefs has been a great thing because I look at it as persuasive storytelling, quite frankly. Mm-hmm. And, I've always wanted to transition that into actually writing a book or a novel, and had this story percolating about my grandfather's life. And like everyone else, 2020 was completely insane, and had a little bit more time being at home and writing some thoughts down. And my wife said, you really need to kind of put this in a book. If we're not going to do it now, when are you ever going to have this time at home again? And so, the book, and I'll do the flash of the book. So this became my The Road Will Someday Bend became a COVID baby for me. And I loved every minute of it. So it was a different style of writing than I've ever done. But I think people that naturally love to tell stories and write, you have to be writing all the time. And so this was just me redirecting energy I've always had.
How important was your wife's encouragement to kind of getting you off your tail and putting the words on the page?
Well, I think, I say this for everything, and hopefully she'll watch or listen to this sometime. My wife is my absolute partner in everything. So I've been very fortunate. We're high school sweethearts. So we just celebrated our 15-year anniversary. We've been together for 23 years. I think like anything in life that you do, whether it's professionally, personally, if you have a supporting partner, unbelievable to really, it wasn't just taking the leap, as you have a level of vulnerability when you put something out into the world. And so she's a middle school English teacher, and she's an avid reader. I mean, I'll read 15 to 20 books in a year. She'll read like 100 books in a year. She just loves to be reading all the time. So for me, what was important was when I first thought I was going to do this story, I knew I could start, and I'm a goal-oriented person. So I looked at it almost like running a marathon. I think people look at a marathon similarly with writing a book as this huge overall project. And I think the sum of the parts freaks people out from starting. And I'm pretty confident that once I just start something, I'm going to see it through. Where my wife really was supportive was, before anyone else in the world saw it, she did. So every time I'd write a chapter, she would be the first person that would read it and give some, third-party thoughts about where the story was going. And I kind of made the commitment to her that I knew I was going to finish this book. I wanted her to be brutally honest so that if she was really interested, I was going to keep showing it to her. And if she wasn't interested, I think I still would have finished, but I'm not sure I would have gone about putting it out in the world the way I did. So I'm incredibly thankful for that for her.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I hear from authors. I mean, aside from having a good story and having the talent to write it, is having somebody in your life at some point who encourages you to kind of do it. And for some people, it's, the third grade teacher who notices something in their abilities and encourages them from a very young age. And in your case, it sounds like your wife was really, who you needed to hear from and kind of give you the courage to be vulnerable, because, you're right. I mean, writing is, there's few things in life that are more vulnerable than, and, putting your thoughts on a piece of paper on a screen and then sharing them with other people. I mean, that
Yep.
takes a tremendous amount of, vulnerability if you're really being honest about the craft.
Yeah, I mean, and I think I'm fortunate. In addition to my wife, I had and it still do have very supportive parents. So my whole life, it was kind of, if you want to do something, you're going to do it, and you'll figure out a way to do it. And so I think not everyone has that support. Don't get me wrong, we all face our challenges, and some things are harder than others. But I was always brought up, you work your tail off and you do things the right way. Just get it done. Be accountable to yourself. Sometimes it's great to put a goal out there. And, one of the things about saying it out loud to my wife was all of a sudden there was this accountability. It was real. It was out there in the world. It wasn't just percolating in my head. So I was fortunate for that to have happened, for sure.
What did you study at UConn? I mean, obviously you're a lawyer, by trade now. What were you studying when you were up in the stores?
History and journalism. So, there were times I actually got into UConn as a business student. And you go to that microeconomics class the first time, and there's 150 or 200 people in the room, and I wasn't sure that was for me. I thought I might go into history and either be a professor or a teacher in high school. And then, I wasn't sure I wanted to do that, but I knew I loved writing. And so I was going to change again from history to journalism. And my parents, again, I said they were always been supportive, but they always made sure I was accountable too. Right. So my dad, I remember vividly the conversation where he said, you can do this in addition to a history major, but you get 4 years. You're not going to be hopping from thing to thing. And so, again, I loved writing. So going into it and having I love the American history, World War II history. I really love that aspect of it. And then the journalism component, frankly, helped me for what I do now. You learned how to get to the point, be a concise writer, right? You have to get the reader's attention early on. And I think journalism school and writing for the Daily Campus and some small papers in Connecticut, after that, it teaches you to do that so that you're not just dragging on. You're economic with the words that you're putting on the page, for sure.
Yeah.
So, when that was going on, I also knew I finished up at UConn in 2003, which was kind of the boom of the early 2000s, was kind of the boom of law school, right? If you weren't sure that you were going to be what you're going to do with your liberal arts degree, you either went and got your MBA somewhere or you went and got your law degree. And so what I liked about a law degree is you could kind of do anything with that. You could be in the business world. You can go into teaching if you really wanted to, or you could become a practicing attorney, which is what I ended up doing. So again, 16 plus years later, it was nice to get back to, the book. What I liked about it was it reminded me that I had the muscle of being able to set a goal out there and accomplish it, quite frankly. I don't think it's unique to lawyers, but a lot of jobs, when you've been doing it for almost 2 decades, you get into a rhythm that's comfortable. And the book was I loved doing it, but it was a challenge for sure. But I think the training at UConn for both the history and journalism, on top of what I've ended up doing as an attorney, 100% contributed to the book, not just the writing, quite frankly, but even the research that went into, this is a historical fiction novel, but I didn't want it to be complete fiction. I wanted there to be some meat on the bones so that people could go and look, there's parts of the book where I talk about a baseball game that the main character's at. Mm-hmm. I went and did the research for what the weather was on that date and what the box score was for the game he was allegedly at that date. So a lot of my training went into that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the spark behind the novel. You mentioned your grandfather before. What's the relationship between your grandfather as in the story?
So he's certainly the inspiration behind the story. My grandfather was an amazing guy, but incredibly quiet. So I did not have the full background of his story. I probably still don't until after he passed away, but he was an Italian immigrant. He was born and raised in Anagni, Italy, which is, I don't know if suburbs the right term, but really a village, probably 35, 40 minutes outside of Rome. His family, he didn't want to leave Italy, but his family sent him to the States, for economic reasons, because in the early, 1900s, Italy there weren't as many jobs there, and America was thriving, obviously starting to boom at that point. But also his family wanted to get him away from Mussolini because there was a lot of unrest, obviously, in Europe, given the coming war. And so when he got to the States, he settled in. And within a couple of years of him actually finally getting comfortable here, he was actually drafted by the US Army and had to go back to Europe to fight in World War II. And so that idea, the premise of that story always fascinated me my whole life. I could not imagine my family sending me from the States to Canada or across to Europe, and then within a couple of years having to enlist in an army and fight against my homeland. Right.
Yeah, that's an amazing part is that the fact that he had to fight against his people, basically.
Yep. And so his story is pretty impressive, actually. I mean, he did the North Africa and did fight against some Italian forces, but then he was part of D-Day and then did Bastogne. He went that route. I took the story in a little bit different direction, just for story purposes. I wanted to tie it back into the Italian mainland. And the book does have a lot more. The war part of the book is more on the Italian war front, which quite frankly, I don't think there's enough discussion about that. We read all the time about, the European front in France and what was happening in England, but we don't hear a lot about the North Africa into Sicily, into Italy route. So I tried to do a nice blend where I think his story was kind of the skeleton that I definitely built the story around. But then once I got writing, it's, the characters really took on lives of their own. And I was excited to see what was going to happen next. And the story just kind of evolved into something that I was really happy with at the end.
Yeah, I mean, that's the key is even you getting kind of interested in what happens next, because if you're not interested in what happens next, the reader is probably less likely to be interested in it. What did you learn about yourself as you were going through this process? So clearly you did a lot of writing, I would call it nonfiction up until this point in time. Was this your first? I mean, have you ever tried a short story before, or was this really your first entrance into fiction writing?
I think some judges and opposing counsel may disagree that this was my first fictional storytelling, but I did do a lot of short story writing more in college, but that went away. And really how this evolved and where my challenge was, a few years ago, my wife's father passed away. And I remember being at the wake and her talking to some of his friends about these stories that she had never heard before, and how she had said she wished she had heard more of these types of stories from her father. And so when that happened, I have 2 young kids. I thought I'd start journaling so that they would see a little bit of what was happening in our lives. And I found that to be hard. You get into the mundaneness of some days where you work all day and you don't want to come home and sit down and write that type of style writing. And so I thought this book was going to be something that I could leave my kids, right? So what was challenging through it, I think by nature, I'm not the most patient person in the world. So although I knew where I wanted the story to go, sometimes I'd want to force myself to write because I felt like I had to be writing. And there were days where writing was really easy, but I think I learned pretty early in the process that when it wasn't there in a given day, I didn't want to force anything necessarily. And I found that some of the best writing I did in the book was when I gave it a couple of days to percolate. I'd write a paragraph just so I had something to start from, but then let that sit for a couple of days and then go back to it. And it was amazing when I did that and I'd go run for, an hour or something just to get my thoughts out of my head. That was probably the biggest challenge, was making sure I didn't force things. And then the other challenge, I think, was I always thought that this was going to be very much an outline. And so before I actually started writing, I had outlined the entire book. And then as I started writing, I felt the story going in a different direction than what my outline was. And having to say, I focus so much on putting this outline together, I have to stay with that, and saying that's not where the story needs to go, and kind of letting the story naturally evolve into what it turned into was a challenge, but certainly something that was necessary for the project.
Yeah, and that's something that's key. I mean, you can, and many authors, very successful ones, will always outline, but they don't let that, form handcuffs on them, because you don't even know who your characters are when you write your outline. You haven't even learned about them yet, and your character development happens over time, so that when you come to, the outline where you think you're going left, but now the story has to go right, you've got to give yourself permission to make that change. So, but the outlining is, and I've heard it from so many people. It's like, it's such a more efficient way to go about, helping you start off, at least even just start off the story.
It definitely helped at least get some thoughts out. And there were definitely parts of the outline that I would incorporate back into the story. But I think, and it may be frankly from some of my legal training, and you could probably hear it in this podcast, I kind of think best out loud, right? So, and I treat writing the same way. My style of writing, whether it's with the book, whether it's with a trial brief or something of that nature, I love just getting as much down on a piece of paper as possible. And then I'm a little bit of a combination of present versus old school. I don't like editing on a computer. I love printing out whatever I've written and then getting a red pen and just completely hacking into it. And it's amazing that even during that editing process, how much a story, a particular chapter or a scene that you're in can change. So I think, you're right. Being flexible and being able to have a guide, but not be so rigid that you're tied to that and it handcuffs you in a way. Very important during the process for me, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. When you were done with it and you kind of went through, all of your final edits, what was your next process? Did you query it to agents? Did you attempt to do that and go through that humbling process?
I did not. What I did, so I had a couple friends who are, they weren't with the big agencies, but I had a couple friends that do the hybrid publishing, helping out self-publishing, who I kind of used as beta readers as they were going through the process. We had thought about, and my wife and I talked, she was a partner throughout this process. So she was my first editor. And then after I really hacked it up a few times, I knew that there were things, I'm confident in my writing, but I'm certainly, writing from a first person perspective was completely different. Conversations on the page were different. I knew I needed help. And so I did, I had a friend who had a colleague that had a small publishing group that did a lot of historical fiction type work. And it was more of a self-publishing process where I worked with them as to using their professional editors and some of their marketing. But I wanted to make sure, I guess a little bit what I left out before during the COVID process. When I started writing this, it was more of, I was 39 years old and I said, it would be great to have this out there when I turned 40.
Yeah.
And so I didn't want to wait for a big publishing house. I wanted to make sure this got out there. And so I thought the self-publishing route worked better for me. And again, I worked with Halo Publishing that had a little bit more reach. They could get me into some of the retailers I wanted to be involved with without going through the whole process of waiting for a larger publisher that I would love to say that they would have picked up this book and 100% would have put it on the shelves, but I knew that wasn't a guarantee if I went that route. And it was important for me to get it out there. So that was the better route for me, for sure.
Yeah. So thinking about kind of having gone through this process, is there another book in you? Are you thinking about a follow-up?
So there's 100% another book in me. It's not going to be a follow-up to this particular book because I think this was something that was special for me, a story that I wanted to make sure that, again, it wasn't my grandfather's life, but it was certainly based on him. And it was important for me to get that out there. I was just talking to someone today who was telling me that their son is going to college or getting a master's degree. They're going to go to school in New York City. And so for me, I went to law school in New York City. And being in your early 20s, right after September 11th happened, living in New York City, there's a lot of really good stories from the 3 years I had when I was there. I would like, I think, to put it out there. At first, I don't want it to be a memoir. I have too many friends who I have too much respect for that I don't think all of those stories need to be documented. But part of what I liked with my legal career, where I thought I was going to start in the world, was I did work in the New York County District Attorney's Office when I was in law school, which is the Manhattan DA. What, people see Law and Order. That's what I was doing when I was in law school.
You're working for Jack McCoy.
Exactly. So I think some of the stories I have between the work I was doing there in addition to some of the more social aspects of my life in New York. I think I haven't decided whether it's going to be more mystery based, more crime based, more humor based, or a combination. But that, I'm starting to outline things that stick in my mind from 20 years ago that I think you could really easily build a book and some chapters around for sure.
All right. Well, I've got some questions for you that I call the hot seat. Really not all that difficult questions. They're really meant to be fun. But the first one is, and I ask these questions of everybody just to try and see if I find any patterns. The first one is, what were some of your favorite TV shows when you were a kid?
I've listened to your prior pod, so I knew this one was coming, and I had to decide if I wanted to be honest or not. So I'm going to be honest. I loved Dawson's Creek when I was in high school. Absolutely loved Dawson's Creek.
That was what James Vanderbeek was he?
James Vanderbeek,
Yep.
Katie Holmes, Josh Jackson, right? So I was a big Josh Jackson fan from when he was on the Mighty Ducks. So
yeah.
I love Dawson's Creek.
He was also in a great movie called The Skulls. Did you ever see that?
It's like a pretend Yale, right?
It's the Skull and Bone Society. Yeah.
Exactly. So that was great. Again, I'm a kid of I'm the baby in my family. So in the 80s, I was watching a lot of Growing Pains and shows like that, which the Seaver family was very much, there were a lot of similarities with my family, quite frankly. And then I was a kid of TGIF for sure. So Boy Meets World and all those shows in the early 90s.
Yeah, so I'm just a little bit older than you, so I missed some of those early 90 ones, but Growing Pains, absolutely. And I mean, if that was a reflection of your life, was your dad a therapist and your mom a reporter, or?
No, that wasn't, it was just, no. So it's not exactly like that. No, my dad was a professional and my mom was, she worked in a school, just the family dynamic. So I'm the youngest of three. I had an older sister who was certainly the brains of the family. I had a middle brother who's now the classic middle child, great guy, but has that bitterness humor in him sometimes where he could rub, the typical middle child. And so we very much fell in there. And then once they started to bring the younger kid in the end and the show jumped the shark a little bit, that didn't.
Leo DiCaprio. Yeah, they did that in the Brady Bunch too with Cousin Oliver. It's
right.
Like, I don't know why they do that. And then even in, I know way too much about TV, but in Different Strokes, they brought in Sam, the little redheaded kid, Dixie Carter's. I think it was played by Dixie Carter, her son. So yeah, Growing Pains. Show me that smile again. There we go.
Right.
All right. So if we were following you around in your teenage years, and I'm assuming you had a Walkman. You're not that much younger than me that you had an MP3 player, but what albums, cassettes, CDs would we find you listening to in your teenage years?
Pretty eclectic. So again, I'm the youngest. So my sister was a huge U2 Duran Duran person. So I'd have that stuff. My brother was a humongous Def Leppard and Pearl Jam fan, right? So 10 and Versus are two of my favorite rock albums of all time. I was a huge Dave Matthews Band fan, but I also really loved, again, as a kid, it was in high school in the 90s. I loved, the Roots, DMX. There was definitely a hip hop component, Tribe Called Quest. That I felt like I had a really interesting mix. And today I'll listen to Taylor Swift, right? So I like good music and I am open to many different genres, but I think the most played albums would probably be Crash by Dave Matthews Band for sure, and Versus by Pearl Jam.
Yeah, I remember 10 came out right when I was moving into UConn. It came out before that, but I was moving in the fall of 92, and my friend and I listened to it probably 2 or 3 times back to back on the drive up.
Amazing
great album. All right, so aside from writing, what other activities make you happy?
I love cooking. A lot of my work, I love being in court because you can advocate for clients, but a lot of the work you end up doing is you're in an office answering emails, doing a lot of legal writing. So whether it's cooking or some home projects, as I've gotten older, the nicer the house I've bought, the less work I'm doing in it. But I like making things with my hands because creating something out of nothing is not necessarily what my day-to-day job entails. So I do love cooking big Italian meals. That's part of that. that part of the story is in my book. I still remember being a kid having Christmas Eve dinners where it really is like the 7 fishes, the whole deal. And that's all in the book. So that's a big component. I follow my wife and I are basically chaperones for our kids' soccer teams now. So we do a lot of driving and enjoy watching that. And I say this in the nicest way possible. I'm an obnoxious New York Mets, but more so UConn Huskies alum. I am all in on, it could be field hockey. I go to a lot of women's soccer games, football, everything. Basketball, obviously. I'm pretty obnoxious about it, but it's my one vice. I don't gamble. I don't do drugs. UConn is my real hobby, I guess, is the best way.
It was a heartbreaking first round loss in the NCAA tournament.
We're going in the right direction. I think we've been really spoiled for a long time. And I like the direction of the program. I'm hoping, as we talk now, I'm not sure when this will come out. Hopefully the women will be moving towards another title. But I think that the university is going in the right direction with all of that, the athletics program.
Yeah, I went to the game versus the Big East game, was not Seton Hall. Who did we play in the first round of the Big East tournament? I can't even remember. It was because I blocked it out because the night after we lost to Villanova, and I was.
They did beat Seton Hall.
It was Seton Hall. Okay,
yep, in the quarters.
I couldn't remember because I saw 2 games that day and they kind of blended together.
There's nothing like the Big East tournament. I'm so happy that UConn's back in the Big East. That is one of the greatest weeks of the year.
That was a lot of fun. Okay, how about this one? How do you feel when you're looking at a blank piece of paper or a blank computer screen when you're about to write something? What kind of emotions do you experience?
I think it's a little scary and you're in kind of a nervous spot. Once I get my hands on the keyboard and I start typing, it usually takes me a paragraph, but once I get a paragraph out of me, I just want to keep going. So I get excited once that happens for sure.
Yeah, once the train starts rolling. I guess the trick is getting the train to start going down the tracks.
Yeah, I think once you get going, it's not a big deal for me. I think and actually I had a question for you with some of the books that you've been writing. I know you have obviously with the Uncorking series, you have this character, right? When you first wrote the first book, did you envision this turning into something that turned into multiple books?
I didn't. So when I started Uncorking a Murder, I had Jimmy Doubts and Farrah Graham. Now Jimmy Doubts is based on my brother. That was actually his nickname in college. So I have a twin brother, and I fell in love with that character. Like I gave him many of my twin brother's personality characteristics. And I didn't think it was going to be a series, but then I just fell in love with these 2 characters. I thought that there was more. They had some more stories, more adventures in them. And so that became a 4-book series, probably a 5-book series, if I get my act together. So no, I didn't go into it thinking it was going to be a series, but it just kind of naturally went that way because the response to that first book was people really like those 2 characters.
And I got here. So I've got my
look at you. So oh my gosh.
I came prepared. But do you think you have the George R.R. Martin syndrome? Or are you going to get that last book out of you or?
Oh no. Yeah. They'll be, I'm already noodling on it. The problem is I have, there's a piece of nonfiction I need to write that I promised myself I would. So I need to pay a little bit of attention to that. And that's going to take me at least, probably an 18-month project. So we'll see. Jimmy and Farrah, they're doing okay right now. They're on vacation. They're having a good life.
That's great.
Any lessons you feel like you learned the hard way about, writing and publishing?
I don't know if I'd call it a lesson. I think I'm glad. It's so unnerving when you first let people know this is happening, right? So the first time I let anyone in my world other than my wife know this was happening, including my family, was when I finished editing the manuscript and was ready to hand it in to the professional editor, I kind of threw out on social media just the stack of what that was, right? And I wasn't sure what the response was going to be. Thankfully, I had really great support and people really have enjoyed the book. I'm proud that I was willing to put myself out there. I think a lot of what we do in this world, and it's not just writing, it's everything in this world. I think we waste so much time and energy worrying, one, what other people are going to think, but two, the kind of the buildup. Instead of just saying, you know what, this is who I am, this is what I want, and getting it out there. I'm glad I saw that through, because I think, you know, people say there's a book in everybody. I think there's a lot of books in everybody. You just have to be willing to spend the time. It is a lot of time. I spent a lot of, you know, I've got a wife and kids. There was a lot of 9 p.m. till 1 a.m. writing sessions, because that was when I had free time.
Yeah.
And I don't miss falling asleep at 2 o'clock and because you wanted to keep writing, you had more to say, but it was 2 o'clock in the morning and you had to work the next day. But at the end of the day, I'm proud I saw it through and was willing to let other people into this world, because it was something I wasn't sure when I started. I had an idea where I wanted to start the book. I had an idea where I wanted the book to end. I had, Eddie Vedder's The In Between Is Mine, right? I didn't know what was going to happen in there. And I'm excited with what came out of it and what people's response has been so far.
All right, last one up. This one is the one that some people have a hard time with, but I call it the Brad Paisley letter to me question. Basically ripping off his song Letter to Me, where you could write a letter to your younger self and give yourself some reassuring words or advice. If you could do that and send that through the magical mail, what are some things you might tell a younger Matthew Necci?
I've been lucky in that. Again, there's really two things that have stood out for me. One is something that it was my family's kind of mantra was help who you can, when you can, how you can. And so I've tried to, my adult life, take that, whether it's helping do some work in the nonprofit world or trying to really focus my career and going towards serving others. I think that's something that's coming. And I think that's something I knew I wanted. But again, until you live a life, I'm 40, I still feel like I'm my parents' kid. I don't really think of myself as an adult yet, but sitting back, see it through, that actually works out really well. And then, something my wife and we have this phrase framed in our house that just says, work hard and be good to people, because we want our kids to see that when they go outside every day. And I have found, again, and I'm hoping I knew this when I was younger, but in case I didn't, I would certainly say this. If you work really hard, whether it's in relationships, your work, your hobbies, your passions, it doesn't mean you can't be good to people just because you're trying to do something for yourself. So make sure whatever you do, you work hard and you treat people really well. I find that things tend to work out for people that follow that path.
Yeah, it's a quote Bill and Ted, or to paraphrase, be excellent to each other.
Exactly. Absolutely.
So Matthew, where can people purchase The Road Will Someday Bend?
So it is available on Amazon. It's available on Barnes & Noble, Goodreads, all those online retailers. In Connecticut, there have been some smaller bookshops in Glastonbury and Madison that have been carrying the book, which has been really great. There's a couple, I'm told there's a couple spots actually in Italy that have been carrying the book, which is pretty cool to see. But the quickest way to get it for sure in all formats is through Amazon or Barnes & Noble.
All right, there you go. And then if people wanted to follow you on social media, throw out some of your socials or a website if you have one.
Yeah, so UConn Necci, UConnetch. I am on Twitter all the time talking about all things UConn, Hartford, New York Mets. It's tough to, I haven't talked about the Oscars last night yet because I'm not even sure what to talk about.
I'm still processing it.
Really, it's like, what do you say? I'm still not sure what to say other than Chris Rock. I won't comment on the joke, but his response after the fact, about as professional as he could have been. So good for him on that. But UConn Necci on Twitter and Instagram are really where you'll find me online.
There it is. All right, Matthew Necci, thank you so much for letting me uncork your story.
Thanks, Mike.